welcome to Careful Consideration of Our Common Concerns. I'm Dr. Ted Noel. With all the hype and noise that comes around all of the politics and medicine of the vaccines and COVID-19, it's time we took a little bit of a look at the science behind vaccines and then look at it as it applies to COVID-19. Now, I am going to stay pretty much out of politics in this video. I really want to stay very close to the science. And first, let me make an admission. There are 3 or 4 big things in this discussion that I should have thought about at the very beginning of the so-called pandemic. And then I've just recently tumbled to with one of those great duh moments, which says, "You idiot, why didn't you see this sooner?" And we'll get to those in a moment. The first thing to look at, though, is the concept of a vaccine's been around for a long time. And there have been things that are kind of folk wisdom, for example, your chickenpox parties and so on, where kids would get a mild case of the disease and then they're immune forever after, that kind of thing. That's just folk medicine, and it does work. One of the things about folk medicine is that most of the time it has a real scientific basis. It's just that the people doing it didn't understand that basis. So, if we go back and we look in the 18th century, we find that smallpox was a major plague. It would kill roughly 20% of the population. That is a huge, huge burden, far bigger than anything dreamed about for COVID-19. And there were a number of people who undertook a procedure called variolation. Now, if you look at the picture, you see a physician who is making some cuts in a lady's arm. And the idea is he would then cut into a blister or pustule of someone who has smallpox, take some of that yucky material and rub it into those cuts. When he does that, the smallpox gets into the new person and they get infected. Now, the idea was if you get infected this way, you're going to get less of a disease than if you did it any other way. The problem was that still between 1 and 2% of every person, you take 100 people, 1 or 2 of them are going to die from this approach. And any of you who watched the miniseries John Adams will recall a scene where Abigail Adams has all of her kids together. She and all of her kids get variolated, and the doctor has a really, really sick kid who's probably going to die on a trailer, and the hope is that his death will save the others. And of course, in the Adams story, one of the kids almost dies, but she pulls through, and now they're immune to smallpox. Well, remember, this is happening in the 1770s. It wasn't until 20 or 30 years later, 1798 if memory serves, that Edward Jenner, capitalizing on observations that milkmaids just didn't get smallpox, connected the idea that cowpox, which was a viral infection of the cows, got into the milkmaids. They got a mild self-limited disease, and that conferred immunity to the worst disease. And so what he did was to do variolation, but not from smallpox to smallpox, but cowpox against smallpox. And lo and behold, it worked. Now, other people had done it before him, but his work in the late 1700s, after the American Revolution, was the work that began to show that immunization by way of a vaccination, and he called it vaccination, could confer immunity. The next thing that we look at is the key to our discussion. It is really the key. And I have to remind you that all of us look at this picture of the coronavirus, and that isn't what it looks like. It looks kind of lumpy, and it's got a few spikes on it. It doesn't have this beautiful artistic approach. But all we ever think about are those little red spikes, because those would be the attachment sites. And what happens is that those little red spikes find the ACE2 receptor on a human cell and latch on. Then an enzyme called furin cuts off the spike. The rest of the virus gets into the cell. It makes new viruses, and that's the rest of the story. Or is it? The problem here is the virus has more than one antigen on the surface. Now, this is a new word for you. An antigen is a protein that is not me. Okay, that's all it means. It is some chemical that is not me. It is antigenic in that it stirs up my immune response. That's what an antigen does. And so when we look at it, we say, oh, we got all those little red spikes. We'll make antibodies to those spikes. So the Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines all code for the spike protein. Now, Johnson & Johnson used a somewhat conventional technique. They used a crippled adenovirus, which is one of the ones that can cause a common cold. There's only about 200 of them. And they took the adenovirus and they put the spike protein on it. Then when you get a shot from the J&J, that spike protein stands out there and you make antibodies to the spike protein. That's how your immunity gets stripped. That's kind of conventional. The Moderna and the Pfizer do it a little differently. They say, let's short circuit all of this if maybe stuff that goes on with the other virus. Let's just use what's called messenger RNA. We inject it in a form that can get taken into the cells, and that will then get taken up by what are called ribosomes. The ribosomes see this messenger RNA. They use it as a template to make spike proteins, which are then sent out. They get outside the cell and they stir up immunity. That sounds great, but there are 3 other proteins that they could have chosen. They are the envelope, the membrane, and the nucleocapsid. There are 3 of them. 3. The spike is the 4th one. Well, we know now without any doubt that the spike protein is actually the part of the virus that makes you sick. It is the pathogenic element in the virus. And because they are coding for that, what they are functionally doing is giving you a case of COVID. And this explains why we have a number of cases of sudden death, myocarditis, strokes, you name it, and such, in people who've been vaccinated, and these happen very shortly thereafter. We have a world-class tennis pro who, because of his vaccine, he had to quit competing. He just simply couldn't do it anymore. You know, you go on down the line, and it turns out that if we do careful statistical analysis, the vaccine is more likely to cause you permanent harm than COVID-19 is. File that one away next time somebody says we have got to get vaccinated. Vaccination is higher risk than the bug is, and we can talk about that a bit later. In any case, instead of choosing one of the other 3 antigens, which incidentally are all benign, they don't cause any illness. And that's the whole point of vaccination. Normally, you will get a material that stirs an immune response without making you sick. With all 3 of the U.S. approved vaccines, you get a material that makes you sick and can kill you in order to get you immune. Once the virus is inhaled, let's take a look at what happens. This is a picture of a pulmonary alveolus. That's the air sac in your lung. And if you look at it rather carefully, in the middle of it, you'll see 3 letters in bright red, air, because that's what the air sac has in it primarily. Now, inside it are 3 types of cells. There's pneumocyte type 1 and 2, and there are what are called alveolar macrophages. But here's the key. These are inside the airspace. The pneumocytes are structural. The macrophage can move around and gobble up gunk. And that's its job. It uses what are called pattern recognition receptors to say, oh, that piece of whatever it is not good for us. Gobble it up so that it can't cause any harm. That's the way it works. But let's suppose you take a breath and happen to have aerosols from somebody who's shedding COVID-19. Where do those aerosols go? They go right into the middle of that air sac, and the macrophage will catch some of them. But guess what? You've got all those other pneumocytes, and it lands on those, and they have ACE2 receptors. And so the virus grabs onto the pneumocytes. Furin cleaves off the spike. The virus goes inside the cell and gets busy making more viruses. When that happens, which way is the cell facing? That cell is facing the airspace. So when it makes more virus, where does the virus go? It goes into the airspace, and you breathe it back out. It does not care whether you are immunized, vaccinated, have had COVID before, or none of the above. You get it in, it infects those pneumocytes, and the pneumocytes shed more virus so you can spread it to somebody else. As a matter of fact, studies have shown that fully immune people who have high antibody titers have just as much virus in their breath coming out as people who got sick and never were immunized. Same amount. And the reason is obvious. It hasn't gotten to the bloodstream. You see, antibodies and T cells don't work in the airspace. They don't live in the airspace. Antibodies and T cells are what we call humoral immunity. They live inside the blood. And if you look, you will see 4 large red arrows pointing into the bloodstream. Now, on this particular diagram, you'll see the bloodstream is a bit yellow, and there are red blood cells in it where the arrows are pointing. That's not terribly important, but the fact is that the bloodstream is on the other side of what's called the alveolar basement membrane. Now, the alveolar basement membrane is beautifully designed by God to let gases go across very easily. Oxygen can go across into the blood, carbon dioxide comes out of the blood, and this is how your lungs do their job of exchanging air. You get oxygen in, carbon dioxide goes out. That's how they work. But most of the virus to start with is going back in the air from the pneumocytes. But some of it, you'll notice that the pneumocytes are up against the basement membrane because that's where they're attached. And some of the virus will shed across through the basement membrane into the blood. Now your immunity can work. But notice what happened. Before the virus went into the blood, you were infected. You were spreading virus. You weren't sick, because the places that COVID-19 makes you sick aren't in the air spaces. They're in the bloodstream. All of the places COVID makes you sick have to do basically with inflammation in very, very small blood vessels. Those blood vessels get inflamed, they cause clots, and you get blood flow is distributed in bad places. You get strokes, you get myocarditis, you get kidney failure, run the list. Everything possible happens, and that's all because the spike protein, remember, the spike protein is what the vaccine is giving you, causes that inflammation. It is the bad actor. You were infected without being ill. Notice the distinction. And no vaccine can prevent infection. Rochelle Walensky, director of the Centers for Disease Control, has said so explicitly, and the reason is very simple. You have to get infected before the immune system has any reason to do anything. If you are immune, you get infected, your pneumocytes can shed the bug, but as soon as it comes across in your bloodstream, your antibodies and killer T cells go to work and they mop it up. You don't get sick, but you were infected. This is a key distinction. And it does not matter whether you are vaccinated, had the bug, never had the bug, never got vaccinated. You have to get infected first, and you can always get infected and spread the bug to somebody else. This is basic immunology. Remember also that there are animal reservoirs. So let's say we made everybody in the world completely immune to the bug. New kids are born, they're not immune. Guess what? We know there are animal reservoirs. This bug can live in bats. That's the classic. Oh no, I'm not going to a cave. Fine. It can also live in cats. Big cats at the National Zoo have to have been treated for COVID-19. That means that your Siamese cat can get COVID-19. Is that sneeze your cat did a result of it? But you see, if they can get it, they serve as a reservoir. It can hand it back to you. And your immunity from the vaccine fades. Simple reason. Let's go back to the picture of the virus. There are 4 antigens. You only got vaccinated against the S. And you only got vaccinated against the alpha version of the spike protein. Each of the variants coming along has a little bit different spike protein. Vaccine for the alpha variant is less effective against the delta, lambda, mu, and whatever else comes along. Pretty soon we'll be using hurricane names for all the variants. You have poor immunity with the vaccine. But let's say you caught the bug, and let's say you weren't even sick. You just got it. You got enough to get exposed. Some of it got in your bloodstream. Your immune system started to crank up. You got a very mild, or what we would call subclinical case. And now you have immunity to all of those antigens. The nucleocapsid, the envelope, the spike protein, all of those, all 4 of the antigens are now in your immune memory. And we know from studies in Israel that people who get the bug are 7 times less likely to get it in a breakthrough sense than people who've been vaccinated. Your immunity is longer lasting, much more robust. It's just plain better than being vaccinated. That tells you what you should think about vaccine passports if you've had the bug and recovered. You are in a better shape than somebody with a vaccine passport. But remember, the vaccine passport says, well, we can let you in a restaurant or on a bus or on an airplane or a theater or whatever because you've been vaccinated. What did we just learn about being able to spread the bug? I'm vaccinated. I'm immune. Let's say I've got good, robust immunity to it. But I've been around somebody who was sick and didn't know it, or infected and didn't know it. Maybe even somebody else who was vaccinated who'd seen somebody else who was infected and didn't know it. They got it. They spread it to me. I'm not sick. I don't have a fever. I don't have a headache. I don't have any of that stuff. But my lungs are expelling lots of COVID in my breath. What good is my vaccine passport? It is worthless. Utterly and totally worthless. It means nothing medically. So what do we know right now? There are huge problems with the vaccine program. Instead of being low risk, it's higher risk than getting sick. As a matter of fact, we know, for example, with the Delta variant, data out of England, if you are 50 years old or younger, your risk of dying is indistinguishable from 0. We know that if you get it without vaccination, without any treatment, your risk of going to the hospital is less than 1%. So that's low risk. But let's go on a little further. Nobody is doing studies Or let's pack that up. Nobody's talking about the studies that show that people who have treatment with either hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin don't go to the hospital. They just don't get sick enough. And with ivermectin, the mechanism is real simple. If I take a look at it, let's imagine that the end of this pen is the spike protein. It's red, just like the picture. It can latch on to the ACE2 receptor. But suppose that I cover it up. Can it latch on to anything? No. Ivermectin actually covers up the spike protein. And when it covers up the spike protein, it does a damn good job. So that we now know that healthcare workers in the COVID units, if they get a dose of ivermectin now and a dose a week from now, are protected from getting infected for a month. We also know people who get ivermectin as part of a treatment program in the home don't go to the hospital. It works. So when the FDA tweets out, "You are not a horse, you are not a cow, so stop it," they are just lying to you. I'm not going to give you all of the political reasons. That's for another time. But here's the key. Ivermectin received a Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2015 because it is, in fact, a miracle cure. We now know it has a whole raft of medical actions. This covering up of the spike protein is just one part of it. If you get treatment with ivermectin or with hydroxychloroquine at home in a proven protocol, and there are at least a dozen, you're in great shape. Our government is telling us not to. The reasons are almost certainly related to money and power, and we'll talk about those another time. But the fact is, if you have the ability to get a supply of ivermectin or of hydroxychloroquine, you will avoid all of the problems. Remember, immunology in this case is really very simple. You have to get infected before you get sick. That process of infection takes place in the air sac so that you can infect the next guy without ever knowing it. When it gets into the bloodstream, if you are immune, your immunity will shut it down. If you are not, you may get mildly ill. That's where you say, "Oh, I'm going to get some ivermectin," whatever else. If you get it then, it stops it dead in its tracks. Don't let anyone else tell you anything different. We have very, very good treatments. And oh, by the way, that new Merck drug that cuts the risk of hospitalization in half, yeah, that's nice. It's a monoclonal antibody, but it also costs a bunch and doesn't work as well as ivermectin. That tells you what's going on. By the way, it is extremely likely that I will get knocked off of YouTube soon. So please join me on Parler, Gab, Getter, and on Rumble. Until next time, take a look at those links below. Join me on MeWe or on Parler, the new non-censoring, non-tracking versions of Facebook and Twitter. But if you must use the old left-wing censoring versions, we're still on Facebook and at VidZet on Twitter. The message is what matters. I'm Dr. Ted Noel. Thanks for watching.